Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Plastic Podcast, the show that tells the science and the story of our relationship with plastic. I am your host, Clark Marchese, and today we are talking about anti-plastic movements, Kenya, norms, anti-entrepreneurs, plastic bags, flooding, Bangladesh, corporate playbook, microplastics, global health policy, and so much more. Okay, if you thought that was confusing and chaotic, I apologize, but there is a through line connecting all of those things. In fact, this particular episode is going to be touching on and connecting the dots between many of the topics we have already covered on the show. What this episode does is it traces the emergence of anti-plastic movements, how they spread around the world, and ultimately how they led to the UN Treaty on Plastics. More specifically, the way we trace this in this episode is by examining how and when health concerns regarding plastic began to form and how they spread around the world. And this is based on research that came from an article published by this week's guest. And from it, we get a very logical timeline of plastic awareness and activism, and it explains perfectly how we got to where we are today, which is just a couple weeks away from the 5th International Conference to negotiate the terms of the United Nations Treaty on Plastics Pollution. I thought this episode was a perfect setup for the next one, which just so happens to be all about that treaty. And it is also the last episode of Plastic Podcast. Quickly on that, and I'll also say before you get too sad, Pine Forest Media has other podcasts about science and other things, and we are making even more. So hold back your tears. But in any case, Plastic Podcast was always meant to be a limited series. Before I started, I imagined it would be about 10 episodes, but as soon as I started to dig my hands in, I realized just how much there was to cover. And I think almost 30 episodes later, we have covered quite a lot. And I think that also comes through in the conversation we're about to have with our guests, because, those of us who have been with us for a while will hear references to a number of topics we've already covered. So this is all to say, I feel like this episode ties together neatly what the series was set out to accomplish. And I think one final episode next week on how to better understand what this treaty is and how it works seems to be a natural stopping point for the show. But more on all of this later. Back to the topic of this episode, and our guest who is going to explain how we got to where we are today is named Leah Shipton. Leah is a PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia in the Department of Political Science and an expert in global health policy and governance, with a focus on extractive industries and the impact they have on health and human rights. I came across an article that Leah published, and this article was trying to trace how anti-plastic norms driven by health concerns began to spread around the world. So what is an anti-plastic norm? Well, we will figure that out. I will say this episode is a journey, as has this introduction been. So probably the best thing for us to do is just to get started, and I'll see you on the other side. Without further ado, let us welcome Leah Shipton to the show. All right, we are recording. Well, Leah, welcome to the show. My first question is if you could just tell us a bit about yourself and about your research.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Clark. So I'm Leah Shipton. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. So I live on the sort of unceded lands of the Coast Salish people in what's now Vancouver. And my background is in public health. I spent about 8 years in public health and global health before I moved to a political science PhD program. So now I study the politics of global health governance, and often with the health angle. And so my previous work was on sort of Canada's mining industry overseas and impact on health and human rights. And then I also sort of dabbled briefly, but looking to go back after sort of being reconnected to this topic via your invitation into the sort of the overlap between plastics, pollution, and health.
Okay, perfect. Well, those are very interesting and important. So thank you for your research in that space. And it is lovely to have you on the show. So plastic, obviously, is a major health concern. We have covered plastic and health on the show before, but today we're not necessarily talking about it in the same context. We're going to be talking about global health policy rather than clinical research. And our conversation is going to be largely based on a project of yours that looks at how health-related concerns relate to anti-plastic norms. To set the stage, let's start at the beginning. Maybe can you tell us what is an anti-plastic norm?
Yeah, maybe I'll start with defining a norm first. So norms is from my training in the international relations literature, where it's essentially a norm is it's a should statement. It's an idea about how we should behave about something. So in Canada, for example, and I'm using very simple examples here, when somebody lets you in when you're driving, for example, there's a norm that you would wave thank you, right? Someone send you a favor, you should wave thank you. Not everyone does it, so you can break this norm, but it's noticeable if you don't. Just to sort of convey the idea that norms are standards of behavior that essentially try to govern or provide some sort of order to a group of people, a group of countries, a group of organizations.
Okay, got it. So how do we understand these norms begin or form in the first place? I also came across a term in your research that was a norm entrepreneur. Can you tell us what that is?
Right. So how do these norms get created? They don't come from nowhere. The most standard way of understanding it is they come from individuals, groups, or organizations that are sort of called norm entrepreneurs. And they're persuaders in the world. They're organizations or people that see an issue that probably needs to be addressed in a more productive way. And they work to convince others that we should embrace this sort of new standard of behavior. And they'll use different tactics to do that. The sort of very simple idea here, you have a set of norm entrepreneurs who are advocating a new standard of behavior that we ought to follow. If they convince enough, you have a critical mass of other stakeholders that sign on. And then you have something called a norm cascade where everybody now feels the pressure to align with this behavior.
Okay, so that's what norms and norm entrepreneurs are.
So then we have the anti-plastics piece here. So the anti-plastics norm, if I could say it in a statement, would be plastics should be under strict regulatory control because they're a societal and environmental threat. So that's like the should statement here. There's something wrong with plastics pollution. They're doing harm, and therefore we should, act on them. We should regulate them. We should, and by regulate, I mean impose fees on their use at the consumer level, for example, or we should ban their use completely.
Okay, I think that's a perfect foundation for what we're going to discuss today, which is the evolution of these anti-plastic norms over time on both a global and local scale. In a general sense, can you help us understand where these anti-plastic norms started to form?
I think there's something not different, but the anti-plastic norms goes against the conventional logic, which is that norm entrepreneurs at the international level set standards of behavior, and then that trickles down to countries, right? That's maybe what we initially were thinking when this literature and research was established in the 90s and 2000s. And then in the next iteration of this literature, we're saying, hold on, we can't forget that like people in countries around the world are like leading normative efforts and whatnot. So in the case of anti-plastic, there's general agreement that these norms emerge as a result of norm entrepreneurs at like the local domestic level that were responding to issues of plastic pollution as they saw it in their own countries or their own contexts. And so, yeah, rather than created at the international level, these norms were pioneered by domestic stakeholders, often civil society, often sometimes as well as academics who are part of civil society, who eventually got allies in government. And they saw plastic pollution as a problem, and they began sort of persuading those around them to do something about it, right? There's a lot of problems that these actors are trying to solve, right? Sometimes it's a waste management problem, sometimes it's health, sometimes it's the way plastic impacts the environment or agriculture. And so the problems at the domestic level can be different. I don't think there's consensus that there's just one problem that plastics cause that galvanized everybody to address to create the anti-plastics norm. I think we have to make space for the fact that the world is diverse. And so the issues that are happening at the local level are going to vary. But I think what is consistent is that you have people at the local level who are seeing a specific problem that matters in their context.
Okay, you're saying a lot of things that will make complete and total sense to anyone who's been following the story arc of this podcast. Sustainability in context, the power of local and grassroots actions, plastic is a multifaceted issue. It is music to my ears. And we know plastic being such a multifaceted issue, there's lots of different concerns that one might have or a community might have that will drive action. One other term I came across in your research was a value, and your paper is focusing on health. Can you explain how health is sort of a value driving these norms?
Yeah, so we've called them, in my work with Peter DeVerne on this paper, we've called them values, labeled them as values. So the problem is the plastics pollution. The value, as in the thing that we value, is health and tourism and whatnot. And this is the sort of protecting that value, the protecting that thing that we value would be the driver. I know other people would maybe flip it. They would say that the problem is the impact on health, for example. or the problem is the impact on tourism, but we've just separated that out a little bit because we see that these norm entrepreneurs are motivated to protect this particular area that's important culturally, politically, economically, etc.
Okay, that makes total sense to me. I do have a question though, because your research has established that health is a very effective value at driving these anti-plastic norms. However, we did do an episode on plastic and human health where the main takeaway was that we have way more questions unanswered than answered by sort of empirical research that is. But we also know that norm entrepreneurs are responding to issues in their communities. So then, in light of the fact that there's still large numbers of research gaps in the medical field about the impacts of plastic on health, what types of things might local communities encounter that would result in having health as the central value?
So I think there's layers to this. I think the first layer is that there's some areas or impacts where you can much more easily identify the connection between plastics pollution and poor health. While there's like an underlying science to it, the lay person can easily understand that plastic pollution is contributing to poor health, not with the naked eye, so to speak, but the causal chain between plastic pollution and health consequences is not that long. And when we go back to some of the norm literature, one set of that literature argues that norms can develop more easily when one, bodily integrity is harmed, especially for vulnerable people, and when the causal link between the cause and the impact of that bodily integrity is really close. Now, it can be close either because maybe there's not that many steps, or because we have, I think, sufficient scientific literature to justify, the solid relationship. So think about smoking and lung cancer. It took a while to establish that literature and evidence, but now that causal relationship is very sort of clear in our minds. But I think speaking, and we'll get to this after this first point, the microplastics, nanoplastics connection with health is vague right now. Like we know it's relevant, but we don't have that, I think, really secure scientific causal link yet in the way that they used to not have the smoking and cancer link. So anyways, I think the first step of this, as it played out in what we call early norm adopters like Bangladesh and in Kenya, is that you would see things like livestock dying because they ingested plastic bags, and that directly impacts food security or livelihood sustainability, which have direct impacts on health. Those are sort of affecting what we call the social determinants of health, where you have social structures that are going to impact health in the long run, right? Or plastic bags that are harboring like water, stagnant water, and then you have, mosquito-borne or other infectious diseases as a result. Rodent infestations due to plastic garbage heaps, drains getting clogged, and then that's causing flooding, which is like compromising agricultural yields or creating pools of stagnant water, or compromising, food insecurity by affecting the livestock. So I think there's like a science that underpins disease spread in each of those scenarios, right? Or the relationship between, like food sustainability or food security and malnutrition, for example, or other health outcomes. But I think that those are impacts that are much more sort of visceral, unavoidable. I think any person can sort of, at least at a general level, connect the dots there, that this is like not good for a person to be experiencing, certainly not at a large scale like we saw in some of these countries, right? Like Bangladesh had 2 weeks of flooding, 75% of the country was covered in the late 90s. And plastic bags clogging the drains were attributed as a huge cause of that event. So I think the first wave of this is that for community members that push this in the early stages, you don't need a medical degree to see that your life is being negatively impacted by plastics pollution. I think this next iteration that we're at that is a bit trickier is what you were speaking about earlier, which is exposure and the buildup of nano and microplastics pollution. And I think that causal chain is longer, it's less clear, it's a bit more delayed. And I think a lot of the recent bans that have come into place are operating a bit on like the precautionary principle, where we know that something is probably not quite right here and we need to be careful, but we're still waiting for the full sort of scope of knowledge around what the health impacts of those micro and nanoplastics will be.
Okay, it's interesting that you're saying this, because another common theme of this podcast so far has been examining where the problems of plastic are most visible and why. So it seems like these early norm adopters, some of them coming from places where the consequences are most visible or inescapable.
100%. And I think that speaks to why countries like Canada could avoid this issue for so long, because one, good waste management systems, and also exported an enormous amount of waste to countries like China or Malaysia or Philippines, right? And so it just makes the problem so visible, right, in global South countries in a way that, you know, those of us in Canada can often avoid, for example, as well as other high-income countries.
Do we know when these health-driven anti-plastic norms started gaining traction or spreading to a global scale?
This goes back to at least the late 90s. And I'll say this. So the way that I would say we're tracking this is by looking at the adoption of anti-plastic like policies, because the adoption of a policy implies the internalization to some degree of a norm. So often what we use to track the norm is the adoption of these policies, right? Because the argument for a lot of us that do this research is you wouldn't have the policy, but the norm didn't exist in the first place. And a lot of these things that are tracked are specifically anti-plastic bags, fees, or bans. So that's what we have as the biggest guidepost here. Anti-plastic bag policies have been adopted since the late 90s in different countries around the world. Bangladesh, for example, Kenya, Denmark, Ireland, by the mid to late 2000s, early 2000s. Yeah, the 2000s saw an uptick by African and some Asian countries. I think we had about 23 or 25 countries in the world with these bans in 2010 with anti-plastic bag bans. But that number doubled in 2016 to 60 countries. And then by 2019, we had 111 countries. And so just to say, we've had this like massive uptick. I think a lot of the early movers, I would argue, were in the global South. Not to say that there weren't early movers in, there was European countries like Germany and Denmark that made some efforts here. But when you look at some of the maps around who adopted these bans sooner, it's a lot of Asian and African countries, less so Latin American countries, not North America, and then some in Europe. And then we can talk about how maybe that started to travel a little bit. And then it's all culminated with the sort of negotiation of the UN plastic treaty right now that was launched in 2022.
Okay, I just had sort of an aha moment because I've been hearing about this treaty in a good number of interviews I've done for this show. And I've been asking myself, like, well, how do we get to the point where this is actually something that's on the table or being discussed? But yeah, hearing you tell that full story makes that connection really clear.
It's definitely a groundswell movement that came up right now. It's been adopted across the world horizontally that we need to address these issues, and now there's international cooperation around it. So definitely a story there.
Let's dive a bit deeper then. How do we get from these local responses from different places around the world ultimately to a high level of international cooperation and a collective global response?
This is our hunch from the research, but essentially we definitely need more research on this. Our sense is that there's a learning process that takes place between these early adopters and like later adopters, we call them. And that happens in two ways. One, you have like media coverage that is covering these issues to international audiences, and they persistently mention public health concerns and scientific evidence supporting these concerns about plastics pollution. And so you have coverage. And so there's several high profile examples in the case of Bangladesh and Kenya, where there's coverage of the particular health issues stemming from plastics pollution. Some of it is not very flattering. And so this is sort of coming up as a major issue. But, the policy diffusion literature talks about how policymakers literally look to their neighbors and learn about, what they're doing to address a particular issue. So that's one way is the sort of we're pitching is the media coverage. The second is that norm entrepreneurs that we talked about sooner. So these are people that are championing, the anti-plastics norms. They participate in different regional and international forums, and they exchange information and ideas, right? And they build different ideas around what ought to be done about this issue. And these include government as well as non-government stakeholders that go to these sorts of forums. And so, for example, the G7 declared plastic pollution a major environmental health issue in the mid 2010s. The UN Environmental Program in the Caribbean had a focus on microplastics in 2014. And you have essentially policy networks, stakeholders that are involved in policy in varying degrees who sort of convene in these spaces and learn about what, each of their respective colleagues in other countries are doing to address this issue. So our pitch is that these are sort of two main ways that countries begin to learn, or policymakers or civil society begin to learn about what's happening in other countries. But again, that's something that I would say future research needs to sort of connect the dots in more thoroughly. And then there's a process of considering, is this issue and solution applicable in our own context? So again, we're not saying that they copy and paste the norm exactly how it existed in Bangladesh, in the Bahamas, for example. But there's a process of saying, how is this contextually relevant here, right? What is the problem we're facing? What type of plastic pollution? What is it compromising that we value? Tourism or health, et cetera, et cetera. And then what are the appropriate legislative tools in place or behavior changes in place, essentially at a state level that we are willing to accept, right? And so then we saw a whole host of countries that rearranged this norm in a way that was locally applicable, right? And relevant. And then I think what was interesting is, especially in like the mid 2010s, is that the efforts of those later adopters like circled back to the early adopters again through the media coverage and the international regional forums, and almost like revived efforts in those original, early adopters to re-engage with these issues that went unresolved, or it still resonated with a locally significant problem. So once microplastics was picked up, for example, in Bahamas and Canada, you saw also a revival of this issue in Kenya and Bangladesh, but centering microplastics this time instead of the flooding and all of that other stuff. The social world is very messy, so we're trying to put like frameworks that make sense of what we see, and it's all very complicated, but that would be the general cycle.
Okay, again, this is just connecting so many dots. And if the early adopters were areas that were faced with the visible problems of plastics, we know why they all were in the global south, which is something we've talked about on the show before, is sort of the political, social, and economic aspects of the global plastic waste economy. But I'll also point out that, the reason why that second wave that was prompted after identifying the presence of microplastics started in the global north is because the North has the money and the resources to do that kind of research that's capable of quantifying them. Whereas we know that there are major research gaps in the global south when it comes to the same issues. Moving on to another vocab word, because while this trend of awareness and action is nice to hear about, it's also my understanding that it has not gone unopposed. So can you tell us what a norm anti-entrepreneur is and how it applies to this conversation?
Yeah. So anti-entrepreneurs are essentially individuals or groups or organizations. Usually they come in the form of companies or industry associations that work against the norm and those that are advocating for it. And so I think if I could put it simply, like they'd be pro-plastics essentially, and therefore working against the idea that plastics are harmful and require regulation. I would argue this is most often companies and industry associations operating domestically or also transnationally that are the most sort of ardent anti-entrepreneurs. And certainly they have allies within other, agencies of government, right? But there's something distinct here around pioneering a particular perspective, right? They might have allies in government, but you don't necessarily have the government who's out there championing these particular views. So their way of influencing things can look a lot of ways. Maybe I can highlight a few here. And all of this is quite consistent with like what those of us in global health would call like the corporate playbook. There's a really consistent set of tools that corporations use to influence health, from the products they produce through the production of those products, through the distribution of them, influencing policy, all of these sorts of pieces. And so this is really getting on that. So in the same way that norm entrepreneurs are framing an issue of plastics pollution as a health issue, right, as compromise our health, these anti-entrepreneurs would frame, plastics as an economic issue, meaning that plastics are good for the national economy. They provide jobs to a large portion of the population, and therefore they're trying to work against the norm, the anti-plastics norm, by sort of emphasizing the economic viability of this area, right? And this is especially persuasive if the manufacturing industry is an important sort of economic contributor in a country, right? So in Kenya, the Kenya Association of Manufacturers argued that enforcing the bans would cause up to like 70,000 jobs being lost and throw the country's 170 manufacturing firms into financial turmoil. And that's a more persuasive reframe of this issue when there's a strong, economic base, right? Or there's a lot of people that actually would be affected by this. Then you have sort of classic lobbying of government officials, both from domestic and international stakeholders. So in 2018, the pro-plastic lobby succeeded in blocking efforts by the government to extend the anti-plastic bag ban to all single-use plastics using a particular type of plastic. The American Chemistry Council is a trade association for U.S. chemical firms. They've been lobbying excessively in Kenya because they'd essentially like Kenya to emerge as a hub for distributing U.S.-made plastics across Africa. And then they're highly present at international negotiations. So right now with the UN plastic treaty negotiations, they've been very present and lobbying. And then I think the third way that they do this is promoting policy alternatives. So a very common one here on the plastics industry and trade groups is their promotion of recycling as a viable solution to plastics pollution, even though it's costly, infeasible, and as we know, it doesn't really work, right? Like I think there's lots of stats showing like 9% of plastic is recycled or something absurd like that in Canada. So in February 2024, a study came out from the Center for Climate Integrity that unpacks this a little further and essentially shows how, since the 1980s, big oil and plastics industry have known that recycling is not a long-term sustainable solution, but they push it anyways because it's a convenient alternative to essentially addressing overconsumption and overproduction of plastics. So that's a third way that these anti-entrepreneurs can address this issue. And the thing is, some of what they're saying, like there's something valid about this, right? Like there are consequences to any sort of policy intervention. So it's not that these things, I mean, some of these things are flat out wrong, like, but some of it is preying on some sort of kind of like legitimate concerns, if that makes sense, emphasizing it in such an excessive way that completely allows us to, allows them to avoid, any sort of complicity if we have it in this, right?
Okay, thank you for outlining that. And I think you're right in mentioning that it can get tricky because there are some valid points sprinkled in there. Even this podcast is meant to tell the full science and story of our human relationship with plastic, right? Be it economic in terms of the jobs that plastic provides for people, even relating to health, right? Like as many health consequences as there might be from plastics, we also know that plastic also, protects against some other health ailments. So it's a bit tricky to navigate at times. I think these concerns are a lot more valid if they're coming from stakeholders who are genuinely concerned with just transition. But I think we have to remember that most of the time, the people who are reminding us of these points over and over again, these norm anti-entrepreneurs are coming from a motivation that is trying to make money. I guess we just must take it with a pinch of salt.
I had done some research earlier on the negotiation of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, and for very valid reasons, pro-tobacco control coalition had no desire to engage with the industry, right, with the tobacco industry, because the tobacco industry had just behaved so poorly. They are like the poster child of sort of like poor corporate conduct and producing just an inherently sort of harmful product, right? But the refusal to engage meant that we couldn't tackle issues like regulation of the supply chain, because you can't tackle that issue if we aren't working in these companies, right? And so it's a very tricky space to navigate, and I would be so fascinated to see how this plays out with plastics. I mean, it's already different at the treaty level for plastics because it sounds like industry is allowed to be there, and they were not allowed. They did get in anyways through country delegations, but they were not allowed to be there, I guess, as their own stakeholders. They weren't approved to be let in. But anyways, I say that to say that inevitably, when it comes to, I think, these public health and environmental issues, we have to squabble with figuring out what is the appropriate degree of engagement with these industry stakeholders.
I can't even believe how many things you're teaching me today. I had not learned that the corporate actors are actually taking up space in the negotiating process, but that is definitely something we need to keep an eye on going forward. And, in fact, I'll make a note to ask our next guest about that when we talk about the treaty. So for listeners, stay tuned for next week. I think we are going to start to come to our final couple of questions. One of which is there anything that we missed today? Anything that you think we can't finish this conversation without talking about?
I think probably maybe two things. One, I like a lot of this, like we're not starting from scratch. I think that's what I always think is important to remember. So there's a lot of knowledge we have about how to build effective coalitions in international treaties so that we can have strong provisions. We know how to overcome the corporate playbook in a lot of ways, or at least we know what it is, and we have strategies for overcoming it. So I think that, I think we've alluded to it throughout this whole conversation, but I do think it's important to remember that we're not starting from scratch here around how to tackle these issues. And then I guess probably, and I have to remind myself that this is really centering the most sort of marginalized in these conversations, right? Like the impacts of plastic pollution, whether it be health or environment or et cetera, is not evenly distributed in the same way that COVID impact was not evenly distributed. People who are made systematically vulnerable or marginalized are sort of the most at risk for all of these things that we're concerned about when it comes to plastics. And I do think that needs to continually be centered in these conversations.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. And I think it gets back to this concept of a just transition, which we need to keep in mind at all times, right? Because when we mention that these anti-entrepreneurs are using legitimate concerns, it's true that, changes we make towards sustainability will impact, certain groups of people in negative ways. At the same time, we do need to make changes, not just with plastic, but for a host of climate and sustainability issues. And I think the large conglomerates can probably swallow the cost of change, but we have to make sure that we're not leaving these more vulnerable communities or those likely to be impacted out of the equation. I think that might be the note to end on. The last question I have for you is, where can people find you and follow your work?
Yeah. And I love how in the notes you said, if you want to be found. It's funny.
I mean, it's your choice after all.
No, I mean, I'm on Twitter, or God, it's X now, right? I don't use it, but if you would like, I periodically update there at Leah Shipton, LeahShipton. I'm definitely not the most scintillating person to follow because I'm not a very social media person, but there's a few updates there. I'm more of a lurker on X than I am. So maybe that's not a very effective plug that I just did, Clark, but yeah, that's where you can find me, or my website as well, leahshipton.com. For contact information, feel free to email me there and we can get in touch more directly.
Perfect. I will make sure to include links to those things in the episode description. At this point, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. I really feel like this podcast is coming to be wrapped up in a neat little bow, in part thanks to you. And also, I want to thank you for your very important research in this space. All right, everyone. I told you this episode was a journey. Thank you for taking it with me. And a final major thank you to Leah Shipton. After putting together this series, I do think that conversation, at least in my brain, did a really good job of bringing together a lot that we talked about in this series. I hope you feel the same. And the next episode, I hope, will just be the cherry on top. I just did that interview today, actually, and I think that anyone who's been listening to the show and hearing the treaty mentioned again and again, or who has been curious to learn more about it, will really enjoy the episode. So that's all I have for you today. I will see all of you again right back here next week for the final episode of Plastic Podcast. You've been listening to Plastic Podcast. You can find more information about this week's guest and links to their work in the episode description. Cover art for the show was done by Laurel Wong, and the music you're listening to was done by Tadeo Cabellos. I am your host, Clark Marchese, and this episode was produced and engineered by me. If you loved it and you think more people should hear science communication like this, one of the best things you can do to support the show and help it reach more people is to leave us a one-tap 5-star review wherever you're listening to this now, or a review on Apple Podcast. And also feel more than free to share it with someone who you think might find it interesting. Plastic Podcast is part of a larger network of sciencey podcasts called Pine Forest Media. You can find more information about us in the episode description as well, or on our website at pineforestpods.com. We are also on social media at Pine Forest Media. And we've got some exciting science podcasts coming out this year as this one's coming to a close. Yeah, I hope you join us for those and check out our other ones. And that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll chat soon.